Freddy Fazbear. More than a year ago, I did some classic theoretical game designing and thought about some spicy new ideas for Genshin's combat system, but since then, the game has changed a lot, and so have my ideas. Plus, recently, Genshin has been showing us just how loose the boundaries of their combat system really are. So let's waste no time getting to the hot topic of the day, where I spitball random combat ideas at you, starting with the one part of combat that still has yet to show its full flexibility. Outside of Dendro bursting on the scene and shaking up the status quo, there hasn't really been any major changes in how elements work. Obviously, we probably aren't getting any brand new elements, and they can't exactly change how existing reactions work randomly, but that doesn't mean that we can't do things to mix up how elements work. For one, we can have more characters like Chevrus, Eula, and Nilou who are specifically built around otherwise unpopular elemental reactions, and I think that the two Dendro Pyro reactions are prime real estate for some pandering. Now, to be fair, Burgeon is pretty decent with Pyro Shielders like Zinyan and Toma, but having a Pyro Shielder or maybe even a Pyro Bow or Catalyst character who specifically deals more damage when triggering Burgeon would be nice. And technically, Dea is pretty good for burning team comps, but burning is bad and so is Dea. It doesn't stop me from using them, but I'm just stating the facts. So give us someone who benefits from dealing damage over time. Like, I guess depending on the Pyro Archon's personality, they could be a burning-focused character, or Dottore could drop as a Dendro character focused on burning, since that seems right up his alley. Although, rather than just boosting existing reactions, you could, in a way, make new reactions for specific characters. For example, if Varka, Mondstadt's absentee father, ends up being Mondstadt's first Dendro character, it'd be cool if he had a passive that reduces the cryo resistance of characters affected by Dendro, functioning as a makeshift cryo-Dendro reaction. This would specifically work well with him since most of Mondstadt is actually cryo, and he's specifically tied to characters like Eula, Mika, and Rosaria. It's a little simple and perhaps a bit too support-oriented for Varka specifically, but a character with some kind of cryo-Dendro reaction substitute could be cool. A more complicated reaction idea could be an Animo character who can trigger Swirl from elemental shards left behind by Crystallize. It dealt damage of whatever element the crystallized shard was, as well as Animo and Geo damage. There's not really an existing character that makes sense for, but Mondstadt and Liyue are so closely tied already that I'm sure there'd be no problem creating some kind of traveling merchant or something to that effect. Of course, character-specific effects aren't the only way you can add variety to the elements, and I don't even know if it's necessarily the best way either. I think a potentially much more exciting way to add new elemental functions would be... Recently, we got the Nighttime Whispers artifact set that gives you a boost for Crystallize, which has been something people have wanted for a long time. Nighttime Whispers just ends up boosting your Geo damage when you have a crystallized shield, which is fine, but I think it also would have been cool to have something specifically with the fact that crystallized shields can have elements, like once they expire they explode and deal elemental damage of that type, or they give your team a damage boost of that specific element. But at the same time, one of my biggest issues with most artifacts is how they essentially boil down to a simple damage boost that doesn't really change how you play. There's also the issue of a lot of artifacts being overly specific to certain character kits, which also makes it hard to change how you play. It's fine for some artifacts to be like that, but I'd like more sets that create new playstyles rather than just boosting what the character already does. Keeping on element-related ideas, maybe an artifact set that could double or even triple your character's elemental damage for all elements except their own. Obviously, this would be really good for swirl characters, but you could also have it with elemental infusion teams, and I think that'd be really fun. Another option would be a boost to specific types of reactions, with something like an artifact set that makes the secondary damage from elemental reactions stronger, and maybe they even get more strong over time, which could really help with like burning and electrocharge team comps. You could also try to augment how elements work on their own without a reaction by doing something like, while enemies are affected by pyro, their attacks are weaker, which would also be good for burning teams since that doesn't get rid of the pyro effect. I don't know, maybe I'm too obsessed with the burning reaction. How about an artifact set that rewards you for having a mono-element team? You could just have it boost that elemental damage, but I said straight up damage boosts are lame. So what if the equipped character could apply a burst of a different element's damage, but only when on a mono-element team? Like a set that lets you apply Dendro every 5 seconds with your attacks, but only if you're on a mono pyro team. That's burning again. The point is that elemental reactions still have a lot of potential that can be explored either in character passives or artifact sets. But the possibilities for artifact sets doesn't end with just elemental effects. The biggest missing potential in artifacts at the moment is honestly just one-piece artifact effects, but one, most of my ideas with that have to do with not combat, and two, this video by Raphael pretty much covers every idea I had anyways, so for the sake of treading some new ground and keeping focus on combat, let's think of how Genshin could do cooler artifacts that still mainly affect battles. The biggest one is that you could do something with skill cooldown reduction or attack speed. I know the basic idea of those effects are already present elsewhere in the game, so to get a bit specific for artifacts, maybe using 3 abilities in short succession with your other team members will reset the cooldown on the equipped character's skill, or you gain dramatically increased attack speed for 3 seconds after using your burst, or if you really want, the artifact could just give you the basic stats with no caveats. There are some characters I'd absolutely adore to have shorter skill cooldowns on, or some characters that I'd love to spam basic attacks with, even if it'd be really bad on them. These would all just result in higher DPS at the end of the day, but it'd still be a far more fun bonus than just increasing your damage numbers. And I just want to have a main DPS gun-only Chevreuse that doesn't have 15 seconds of downtime between each attack. Is that so wrong? In a similar vein, I think an artifact set that lets you recharge your burst over time while out of combat would be incredible. Admittedly, this would probably work best as a one-piece set, and also isn't really about combat, which means it breaks both of the rules I mentioned earlier, but it just feels bad to use bursts while exploring because it's often more of a commitment than overworld combat requires, so despite kinda breaking the 2 rules, I still wanted to mention it because I would just really love that effect. A less damage-centric option would be support artifacts that turn any shielding a character would have done into a chunk of healing, or turn any excess healing a character causes into shielding. This would basically allow you to play shielders as healers and vice versa, which I think could be really cool. They wouldn't be effective enough to undermine good team comps in Spiral Abyss, but they'd be good enough in the overworld to let you use characters you like in new ways. Those types of effects would completely change the role of a character, which I could understand not being balanced, not being good for character sales, and generally not being something Hoyoverse would want to do. But I'm sick of having to stick Chi-Chi and Sangonomiya on all my teams because none of my favorite characters are good healers. I mean, I guess Chevreuse, but she's doing damage. I'm not gonna make her a healer, that'd be sacrilege. She has a gun, she's gonna use it. So I think having the ability to completely shift the role a character can play in a team comp would be really fun, but I don't expect it would ever happen. Currently, the only options for playstyle diversity are, do I do what this person is intended to do, or do I slap on a bunch of physical damage stuff, which isn't a very exciting list of possibilities, but I understand why Genshin prefers to push for more variety between different characters, rather than variety in builds on the same character. And I could be down for some new ideas for characters.
I found a special boy.
Yippee!
I'll start by acknowledging that there's a lot of existing character constellations that do most of what I've wanted in previous sections already, and generally, C6 on a character will be such a big change that it can entirely shift a character's playstyle, which is exactly what I'm wanting with most of these. The issue is, constellations are permanent, so you can't go back to the original playstyle, and generally constellations are not very accessible. So I'm gonna pretend that constellations don't exist because they aren't really a good way to add variety to characters in my opinion. On that note, let's start with existing character kits that I want more of. First thing is parries. Candace and Beto are really fun with their parries, and I just want more of those. Yeah, it's that simple. Secondly, I want more characters who can infuse their other party members with an element. Chongyun is great, but Bennett and Candace can only do it with their bursts, which I previously explained is not very consistent to use in the overworld, and Bennett specifically needs constellations, which I also explained my issues with. So ideally, I want more infusions on skills, although putting infusions on artifacts or weapons could also work just as well. So what about a brand new idea that could only work on a character moveset? Give us a mimic or jester type character who can use the abilities of their teammates. Maybe their skill would let them swap between 3 bursts of the other team members, or their burst would let them swap between the skills? Would that lead to insanely busted combinations? Yeah, probably. Does it matter? No. The only reason I was worried about getting too crazy before is that artifacts aren't exactly going to be printing money for Hoyoverse, so putting too many game-changing effects on artifacts probably wouldn't be good for business. Getting crazy with characters, though, will only boost sales for that character and maybe kinda make people complain about power creep, but whatever. This is business, baby. A big way Genshin has made characters unique recently has been to focus them on existing aspects of combat that are otherwise underused. In that vein, an underrepresented aspect of combat that I personally love is pushing around enemies. Admittedly, that general idea is pretty common with animo characters, but there's specific knockback damage that you can do to enemies known as collision damage, so building a character around that could be really cool. Maybe it'd be a sword character with dramatically increased collision damage and reduced stamina consumption on charged attacks. And then you could even give them a skill that pulls any recently hit enemies back to you so you can hit them away again. I think that'd be really fun, although since recent enemies are becoming increasingly immune to knockback, maybe it'd need to be a claymore or something. You could even make every hit of their charged attack deal knockback, so that could have more use, since charge attacks in general just aren't used that often. Another thing I'd love to see is an on-field summon character. Fischl was kind of intended to play like this, where her normal attacks would combo with Oz really well, but now she just sort of summons Oz and then leaves. So maybe make a summoner who needs to be on field directing their summons with their bow. You could even have the summon damage scale with HP while the character's damage doesn't, so the character themselves will be really tanky, but it's still just the summons doing all the damage. But I'd just love a main DPS summoner of some kind. And having more main DPS bow users is also a plus because the current options are Pyro or Sword user. On the topic of bow characters, Genshin has also started making some characters more unique by adding new playstyles to existing weapons, and I think having a different bow battle style could be neat. Like maybe a crossbow kind of style that attacks much more slowly but deals way more damage per shot, and then their aimed shots are always fully charged but just as slow as their normal attacks. Combine that with skills that either lock enemies in place or push them away from you so that you can keep your ideal threat range, and I think it could be a very unique style for bows. Although, I guess while we're on the topic, I kinda already mentioned a lot of ideas that could work well for weapon passives. Attack speed, ability cooldown, overhealing, collision damage, etc, though truthfully I'd prefer those effects to be on artifacts because weapons are limited in what characters can wield them, which isn't as free and fun as putting artifacts on anyone you want. But they've recently had some fun effects with weapons, like the event claymore that gets stronger as you help more Melusines, and that's hilarious, so let's give weapon ideas a shot. First, we'll start by revisiting some of the ideas I just said could apply to weapons and see how they might actually work. For example, for ability cooldown, you could make an energy recharge weapon that takes half of the energy you receive and instead uses it to reduce the cooldown on your skill. For attack speed, I actually think the compound bow does it really well, but I'd like that passive on non-bows, and you could even remove that damage boost just to go all in on the attack speed boost. Collision damage would obviously have to be on a sword or claymore, but I imagine it'd be a physical damage main stat, and maybe it'd give you increased knockback strength against enemies. As for new ideas, an obvious option that's similar to the Melazine Claymore would be to go back and give Sumeru a weapon that gets stronger for helping Aranara. I think a bow would be fitting. You could also have a weapon that gets stronger the more you fish, though there isn't really an end goal to fishing that would serve as a power cap, and meta players already complain about having to fish so much for the weapons that are already there, so maybe this one isn't as great of an idea. I think a much cooler idea would be a weapon that gives you splash damage, which would be especially helpful for weapon types that can only hit single opponents, like a catalyst that makes your normal attacks explode out on hit, or a bow that could just fire out additional arrows at nearby enemies. I'm sure there's a lot of characters that would greatly appreciate having either of those. In a completely different vein, I hold the controversial opinion that I think the Aquila Favonia is a really cool weapon. The Aquila Favonia works incredibly well for basically allowing any sword user to do physical damage semi-competently, which is pretty much the most customizability we have for most characters, so I want to try a couple ideas like that. Maybe a catalyst that boosts all your damage but converts it into physical damage? I'm not addicted to physical damage builds, it's just if we're talking about ways to completely change playstyles, then letting Catalyst characters deal non-elemental attack damage could be cool. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you could have a sword, claymore, spear, or bow that converts your normal attacks into elemental damage. That's kind of just elemental infusion, but being on weapons would probably be way better than being on characters. In fact, for most elements, it would probably be pretty busted, because you could basically create reactions all by yourself. But I think Anemo and Geo would be pretty balanced. Well, if you gave someone a weapon that could apply geo damage instead of physical damage, I think most people would argue that's awful, because most of your elemental reactions would be ruined by crystallize, so having it be infused with Anemo so that all your attacks swirl your reactions would probably be a lot better and more fun, so we'll go with that. But in the end, I'd kinda be shocked if any of these ideas happened. My ideas for character kits could maybe happen, because as I mentioned there, if a character is really crazy and unique, that just encourages more people to pull for them and potentially spend money. So as much as I'd love more avenues for customizability, that's not very likely. Maybe we'll get lucky with an event-exclusive weapon that has some crazy effect, because that'll encourage players to play the event, but I don't really see artifacts ever being more than, do you want your new character to be good? Well, go waste weeks of your life farming this new artifact set that was specifically made to only be good on them. But maybe someday Genshin will suffer enough backlash and complaints to start doing more experimental cool stuff like this. If they don't, I'll probably keep playing it from time to time anyway.